Hey crew, it's Pitt, and I am back with some more freedom. Today's energetic investment in our union is going to be continuing along with the Federalist Papers. We are doing Federalist Paper number 57, 58, 59, and 60 today. All of them have to deal with Congress, and so let's just dig in. From the New York Packet, Tuesday, February the 19th of 1788, authored by Alexander Hamilton or James Madison. To the people of the state of New York. The third charge against the House of Representatives is that it will be taken from that class of citizens which will have least sympathy with the mass of the people, and be most likely to aim at an ambitious sacrifice of the many to the aggrandizement of the few. Of all the objections which have been framed against the federal Constitution, this is perhaps the most extraordinary. Whilst the objection itself is leveled at a pretended oligarchy, the principle of it strikes at the very root of republican government. The aim of every political constitution is, or ought to be, first, to obtain for rulers men who possess most wisdom to discern and most virtue to pursue the common good of the society, and in the next place to take the most effectual precautions for keeping them virtuous while they continue to hold their public trust. The elective mode of obtaining rulers and the uncharacteristic policy of republican government, the means relied on in this form of government for preventing their degeneracy, are numerous and various. The most effectual one is such a limitation on the term of appointments as will maintain a proper responsibility to the people. Let me now ask what circumstance there is in the Constitution of the House of Representatives that violates the principles of republican government, or favors the elevation of the few on the ruins of the many. Let me ask whether every circumstance is not, on the contrary, strictly conformable to these principles, and scrupulously impartial to the rights and pretensions of every class and description of citizens. Who are to be the electors of the federal representatives? Not the rich more than the poor, not the learned more than the ignorant, not the haughty heirs of distinguished names more than the humble sons of obscurity and unpropitious fortune. The electors are to be the great body of the people of the United States. They are to be the same who exercise the right in every state of electing the corresponding branch of the legislature of the state, who are to be the objects of popular choice. Every citizen whose merit may recommend him to the esteem and confidence of his country. No qualification of wealth, of birth, of religious faith, or of a civil profession is permitted to fetter the judgment or disappoint the inclination of the people. If we consider the situation of the men on whom the free suffrages of their fellow citizens may confer the representative trust, we shall find it involving every security which can be devised or desired for their fidelity to their constituents. In the first place, as they will have been distinguished by the preference of their fellow citizens, we are to presume that, in general, they will be somewhat distinguished also by these qualities which entitle them to it, and which promise a sincere and scrupulous regard to the nature of their engagements. In the second place, they will enter into the public service under circumstances which cannot fail to produce a temporary affection at least to their constituents. There is in every breast a sensibility to marks of honor, of favor, of esteem, and of confidence, which, apart from all considerations of interest, is some pledge for grateful and benevolent returns. Ingratitude is a common topic of declamation against human nature, and it must be confessed that instances of it are but too frequent and flagrant, both in public and in private life. But the universal and extreme indignation which it inspires is itself a proof of the energy and prevalence of the contrary sentiment. In the third place, those ties which bind the representative to his constituents are strengthened by motives of a more selfish nature. His pride and vanity attach him to a form of government which favors his pretensions and gives him a share in its honors and distinctions. Whatever hopes or projects might be entertained by a few aspiring characters, it must generally happen that a great proportion of the men deriving their advancement from the influence of the people would have more to hope from a preservation of the favor than from innovations in the government subversive to the authority of the people. All these securities, however, would be found very insufficient without the restraint of frequent elections. Hence, in the fourth place, the House of Representatives is so constituted as to support in the members a habitual recollection of their dependence on the people. Before the sentiments impressed on their minds by the mode of their elevation can be effaced by the exercise of power, they will be compelled to anticipate the moment when their power is to cease, when their exercise of it is to be reviewed, and when they must descend to the level from which they were raised, there forever to remain unless a faithful discharge of their trust shall have established their title to a renewal of it. I will add, as a fifth circumstance in the situation of the House of Representatives, restraining them from oppressive measures, that they can make no law which will not have its full operation on themselves and their friends, as well as on the great mass of society. This has always been deemed one of the strongest bonds by which human policy can connect the rulers and the people together. It creates between them that communion of interest and sympathy of sentiments of which few governments have furnished examples, but without which every government degenerates into tyranny. If it be asked what is to restrain the House of Representatives from making legal discriminations in favor of themselves and a particular class of the society, I answer, the genius of the whole system, the nature of just and constitutional laws, and, above all, the vigilant and manly spirit which actuates the people of America, a spirit of which nourishes freedom, and in return is nourished by it. If this spirit shall ever be so far debased as to tolerate a law not obligatory on the legislature as well as on the people will be prepared to tolerate anything but liberty. Such will be the relation between the House of Representatives and their constituents. Duty, gratitude, interest, ambition itself are the cords by which they will be bound to fidelity and sympathy with the great mass of the people. Is it possible that these may all be insufficient to control the caprice and wickedness of man? But are they not all that government will admit, and that human providence can devise? Are they not the genuine and the characteristics by which means the Republican government provides for the liberty and happiness of the people? Are they not the identical means on which every state government in the Union relies for the attainment of these important ends? What then are we to understand by the objection which this paper has combated? What are we to say to the men who profess the most flaming zeal for Republican government, yet boldly impeach the fundamental principle of it? Who pretend to be champions for the right and the capacity of the people to choose their own rulers, yet maintain that they will prefer only those who will immediately and infallibly betray the trust committed to them? Were the objections to be read by one who had not seen the mode prescribed by the Constitution for the choice of representatives, he could suppose nothing less than that some unreasonable qualification of property was annexed to the right of suffrage, or that the right of eligibility was limited to persons of particular families or fortunes, or at least that the mode prescribed by the state constitutions was in some respect or other very grossly departed from. We have seen how far such a supposition would err, as to the first 2 points, nor would it, in fact, be less erroneous as to the last. The only difference discoverable between the 2 cases is that each representative of the United States will be elected by 5,000 or 6,000 citizens, whilst in the individual states the election of a representative is left to about as many hundreds. Will it be pretended that this difference is sufficient to justify an attachment to the state governments and an abhorrence to the federal government? If this is to be the point on which the objection turns, it deserves to be examined. Is it supported by reason? This cannot be said without maintaining that 5,000 or 6,000 citizens are less capable of choosing a fit representative, or more liable to be corrupted by an unfit one, than 500 or 600. Reason, on the contrary, assures us that, as in so great a number, a fit representative would be most likely to be found, so the choice would be less likely to be diverted from him by the intrigues of the ambitious or the bribes of the rich. Is the consequence from this doctrine admissible? If we say that 500 or 600 citizens are as many as can jointly exercise the right of suffrage, Must we not deprive the people of the immediate choice of their public servants in every instance where the administration of the government does not require as many of them as will amount to one for that number of citizens? Is the doctrine warranted by facts? It was shown in the last paper that the real representation in the British House of Commons very little exceeds the proportion of one for every 30,000 inhabitants. Besides a variety of powerful causes not existing here, and which favor in that country the pretensions of rank and wealth, no person is eligible as a representative of a county unless he possess real estate of the clear value of £600 sterling per year, nor of a city or a borough, unless he possesses a like estate of half that annual value. To this qualification on the part of the county representative is added another on the part of the county electors, which restrains the right of suffrage to persons having a freehold estate of the annual value of more than £20 sterling, according to the present rate of money. Notwithstanding these unfavorable circumstances, and notwithstanding some very unequal laws in the British Code, it cannot be said that the representatives of the nation have elevated the few on the ruins of the many. But we need not resort to foreign experience on this subject. Our own is explicit and decisive. The districts in New Hampshire, which the senators are chosen immediately by the people, are nearly as large as will be necessary for her representatives in the Congress. Those of Massachusetts are larger than will be necessary for that purpose, and those of New York still more so. In the last state, the members of the Assembly for the cities and counties of New York and Albany are elected by very nearly as many voters as will be entitled to a representative in Congress, calculating on the number of 65 representatives only. It makes no difference that in these senatorial districts and counties a number of representatives are voted for by each elector at the same time. If the same electors at the same time are capable of choosing 4 or 5 representatives, they cannot be incapable of choosing one. Pennsylvania is an additional example. Some of her counties, which elect her state representatives, are almost as large as her districts will be by which her federal representatives will be elected. The city of Philadelphia is supposed to contain between 50 and 60,000 souls. It will therefore form nearly 2 districts for the choice of federal representatives. It forms, however, but one county, in which every elector votes for each of its representatives in the state legislature. And what may appear to be still more directly to our purpose, the whole city actually elects a single member for the executive council. This is the case in all the other counties of the state. Are not these facts the most satisfactory proofs of the fallacy which has been employed against the branch of the federal government under consideration? Has it appeared on trial that the senators of New York, Massachusetts, and New Hampshire, Massachusetts, and New York, or the Executive Council of Pennsylvania, or the members of the Assembly of the last 2 states have betrayed any peculiar disposition to sacrifice the many to the few? Or are there in any respect less worthy of their places than the representatives and magistrates appointed in other states by very small divisions of the people? But there are cases of a stronger complexion than any which I have yet quoted. One branch of the legislature in Connecticut is so constituted that each member of it is elected by the whole state. So is the governor of that state of Massachusetts, and of this state, and the president of New Hampshire. I leave every man to decide whether the result of any one of these experiments can be said to countenance a suspicion that a diffusive mode of choosing representatives to the people tends to elevate traitors and to undermine the public liberty. And so ends Federalist Paper number 57, and here it was just a discussion of, look guys, you're going to be properly represented. We are going to do everything that we can do to ensure that you have a valid representative who is most likely to represent your needs. Now, again, this comes down to an informed electorate, right? I hammer that a lot because it is extremely important. Every single step along the way, we have seen just how important it is to be informed about your particular electorate, right? Whoever you in particular have to vote for, you in particular have to be informed on. And so we keep getting that reinforced time and time and time and time again. And that's what's being done here is, okay, this is the means, here is the reasoning, and it seems to be fairly sound, right? There seems to be fairly good reasoning behind it. It has worked pretty well for the last 250 years, arguably, and so it is what it is. Now we're going to read Federalist number 58. Objection that the number of members will not be augmented as the progress of population demands considered by James Madison to the people of the state of New York. The remaining charge against the House of Representatives, which I am to examine, is grounded on a supposition that the number of members will not be augmented from time to time as the progress of population may demand. It has been admitted that this objection, if well supported, would have great weight. The following observations will show that, like most of the other objections against the Constitution, it can only proceed from a partial view of the subject, or from a jealousy which discolors and disfigures every object which it beheld. Number 1. Those who urge the objection seem not to have recollected that the federal Constitution will not suffer by a comparison with the state constitutions, and the security provided for a gradual augmentation of the number of representatives. The number which is to prevail in the first instance is declared to be temporary. Its duration is limited to the short term of 3 years. Within every successive term of 10 years, a census of inhabitants is to be repeated. The unequivocal objection of these regulations are, first, to readjust from time to time the apportionment of representatives to the number of inhabitants, under the single exception that each state shall have one representative at least. Secondly, to augment the number of representatives at the same periods, under the sole limitation that the whole number shall not exceed one for every 30,000 inhabitants. If we review the constitutions of the several states, we shall find that some of them contain no determinate regulations on the subject, that others correspond to pretty much on this point with the federal Constitution, and that the most effectual security in any of them is resolvable into a mere directory provision. 2. As far as experience has taken place on the subject, a gradual increase in representatives under the state constitutions has at least kept pace with that of the constituents, and it appears that the former have been as ready to concur in such measures as the latter have been to call for them. 3. There is a peculiarity in the federal Constitution which ensures a watchful attention in a majority both of the people and of their representatives to a constitutional augmentation of the latter. The peculiarity lies in this, that one branch of the legislature is a representation of citizens, the other of the states. In the former, consequently, the larger states will have most weight. In the latter, the advantage will be in favor of the smaller states. From this circumstance, it may with certainty be inferred that the larger states will be strenuous advocates for increasing the number and weight of that part of the legislation in which their influence predominates. And it so happens that 4 only of the largest will have a majority of the whole votes in the House of Representatives. Should the representatives or people, therefore, of the smaller states oppose at any time a reasonable addition of members, a coalition of a very few states will be sufficient to overrule the opposition. A coalition which, notwithstanding the rivalship and local prejudices which might prevent it on ordinary occasions, would not fail to take place, when not merely prompted by common interest, but justified by equity and the principles of the Constitution. It may be alleged, perhaps, that the Senate would be prompted by like motives to an adverse coalition, and, as their concurrence would be indispensable, the just and constitutional views of the other branch might be defeated. This is the difficulty which has probably created the most serious apprehensions in the jealous friends of a numerous representation. Fortunately, it is among the difficulties which, existing only in appearance, vanish on a close and accurate inspection. The following reflections will, if I mistake not, be admitted to be conclusive and satisfactory on this point. Notwithstanding the equal authority which will subsist between the two houses on all legislative subjects except the originating of money bills, it cannot be doubted that the House, composed of the greater number of members, when supported by the more powerful states and speaking the known and determined sense of the majority of the people, will have no small advantage in a question, depending on the comparative firmness of the two houses. This advantage must be increased by the consciousness felt by the same side of being supported in its demands by right, by reason, and by the Constitution, and the consciousness on the opposite side of contending against the force of all these solemn considerations. It is further to be considered that in the gradation between the smallest and largest states there are several, which, though most likely in general to arrange themselves among the former, are too little removed in extent and population from the latter to second an opposition to their just and legitimate pretensions. Hence, it is by no means certain that a majority of votes, even in the Senate, would be unfriendly to proper augmentations in the number of representatives. It will not be looking too far to add that the senators from all the new states may be gained over to the just views of the House of Representatives by an expedient too obvious to be overlooked. As these states will, for a great length of time, advance in population with peculiar rapidity, they will be interested in frequent reapportionments of the representatives to the number of inhabitants. The large states, therefore, who will prevail in the House of Representatives will have nothing to do but make reapportionments and augmentations mutually conditions of each other, and the senators from all the most growing states will be bound to contend for the latter by the interest in which their states will feel in the former. These considerations seem to afford ample security on this subject, and ought to alone satisfy all the doubts and fears which have been indulged with regard to it. Admitting, however, that they should all be insufficient to subdue the unjust policy of the smaller states, or their predominant influence in the councils of the Senate, a constitutional and infallible resource still remains with the larger states, by which they will be able at all times to accomplish their just purposes. The House of Representatives cannot only refuse, but they alone can propose the supplies requisite for the support of government. They, in a word, hold the purse, that powerful instrument by which we behold, in the history of the British Constitution, an infant and humble representation of the people, gradually enlarging the sphere of its activity and importance, and finally reducing, as far as it seems to have wished, all the overgrown prerogatives of the other branches of the government. This power over the purse may, in fact, be regarded as the most complete and effectual weapon with which any constitution can arm the immediate representatives of the people, for obtaining a redress of every grievance and for carrying into effect every just and salutary measure. But will not the House of Representatives be as much interested as the Senate in maintaining the government in its proper functions? And will they not therefore be unwilling to stake its existence or its reputation on the pliancy of the Senate? Or, if such a trial of firmness between the two branches were hazarded, would not the one be as likely first to yield as the other? These questions will create no difficulty with which those who reflect that in all cases the smaller the number and the more permanent and conspicuous the station of men of power, the stronger must be the interest with which they will individually feel in whatever concerns the government. Those who represent the dignity of their country in the eyes of other nations will be particularly sensible to every prospect of public danger, or of dishonorable stagnation in public affairs. To those causes we are to ascribe the continual triumph of the British House of Commons over the other branches of the government, whenever the engine of a money bill has been employed. An absolute inflexibility on the side of the latter, although it could not have failed to involve every department of the state in the general confusion, has neither been apprehended nor experienced. The utmost degree of firmness that can be displayed by the Federal Senate or President will not be more than equal to a resistance in which they will be supported by constitutional and patriotic principles. In this review of the Constitution of the House of Representatives, I have passed over the circumstances of economy, which, in the present state of affairs, might have had some effect in lessening the temporary number of representatives, and a disregard of which would probably have been as rich a theme as of declamation against the Constitution as has been shown by the smallness of the number proposed. I omit also any remarks on the difficulty which might be found, under present circumstances, in engaging in the federal service a large number of such characters as the people will probably elect. One observation, however, I must be permitted to add on this subject as claiming, in my judgment, a very serious attention. It is that in all legislative assemblies, the greater the number composing them may be, the fewer will be the men who will in fact direct their proceedings. In the first place, the more numerous an assembly may be, of whatever characters composed, the greater is known to be the ascendancy of passion over reason. In the next place, the larger the number, the greater will be the proportion of members of limited information and of weak capacities. Now, it is precisely on characters of this description that the eloquence and address of the few are known to act with all of their force. In the ancient republics, where the whole body of the people assembled in person, a single orator or an artful statesman was generally seen to rule with as complete a sway as if a scepter had been placed in his single hand. On the same principle, the more multitudinous a representative assembly may be rendered, the more it will partake of the infirmities incident to collective meetings of the people. Ignorance will be the dupe of cunning, and passion the slave of sophistry and declamation. The people can never err more than in supposing that by multiplying their representatives beyond a certain limit, they strengthen the barrier against the government of a few. Experience will forever admonish them that, on the contrary, after securing a sufficient number for the purposes of safety, of local information, and of diffusive sympathy with the whole society, they will counteract their own views by every addition to their representatives. The countenance of the government may become more democratic, but the soul that animates it will be more oligarchic. The machine will be enlarged, but the fewer and often the more secret will be the springs by which its motions are directed. As connected with the objection against the number of representatives may properly be here noticed, that which has been suggested against the number made competent for legislative business. It has been said that more than a majority ought to have been required for a quorum, and in particular cases, if not in all, more than a majority of a quorum for a decision. That some advantages might have resulted from such a precaution cannot be denied, but it might have been an additional shield to protect some particular interests, and another obstacle generally to hasty and partial measures. But these considerations are outweighed by the inconveniences in the opposite scale. In all cases where justice or the general good might require new laws to be passed or active measures to be pursued, the fundamental principle of free government would be reversed. It would be no longer the majority that would rule. The power would be transferred to the minority. Were the defensive principle limited to particular cases, an interested minority might take advantage of it to screen themselves from equitable sacrifices to the general weal, or, in particular emergencies, to extort unreasonable indulgences. Lastly, it would facilitate and foster the baneful practice of secessions, a practice which has shown itself even in states where a majority only is required, a practice subversive to all the principles of order and regular government, a practice which leads more directly to public convulsions and the ruin of popular governments than any other which has been yet displayed among us. And so ends Federalist Paper number 58, and again we're just getting a reiteration of, hey guys, this is going to be safe. It is definitely worth noting that our current circumstances are foretold here, right? Populism and sophistry and all of that. That is where we're at. People are making absolutely illogical arguments in defense of absolutely illogical things. And The wheels are definitely being greased for the minority as opposed to the majority, and that has got a lot to do with the number of representatives and the scope of the nation. And I still believe that we have the best system in place. I believe that our checks and balances are better than anywhere else on the planet. And so, yeah. Federalist Paper number 59 concerning the power of Congress to regulate the election of members. From the New York Packet, Friday, February the 22nd, 1788, authored by Alexander Hamilton to the people of the state of New York. The natural order of the subject leads us to consider in this place that provision of the Constitution which authorizes the national legislature to regulate, in the last resort, the election of its own members. It is in these words: the times, places, and manner of holding elections for senators and representatives shall be prescribed in each state by the legislature thereof. But the Congress may, at any time, by law, make or alter such regulations, except as to the places of choosing senators. This provision has not only been declaimed against by those who condemn the Constitution in the gross, but it has been censured by those who objected with less latitude and greater moderation. And in one instance, it has been thought exceptionable by a gentleman who has declared himself the advocate of every other part of the system. I am greatly mistaken, notwithstanding, if there be any article in the whole plan more completely defensible than this. Its propriety rests upon the evidence of this plain proposition, that every government ought to contain in itself the means of its own preservation. Every just reasoner will, at first sight, approve an adherence to this rule in the work of the convention, and will disapprove every deviation from it which may not appear to have been dictated by the necessity of incorporating into the work some particular ingredient, with which a rigid conformity to the rule was incompatible. Even in this case, though he may acquiesce to the necessity, yet he will not cease to regard and to regret a departure from so fundamental a principle, as a portion of the imperfection in the system which may prove the seed of future weakness, and perhaps anarchy. It will not be alleged that an election law could have been framed and inserted in the Constitution, which would have been always applicable to every probable change in the situation of the country. And it will therefore not be denied that a discretionary power over elections ought to exist somewhere. It will, I presume, be as readily conceded that there were only three ways in which this power could have been reasonably modified and disposed: that it must either have been lodged wholly in the national legislature or wholly in the state legislatures, or primarily in the latter and ultimately in the former. The last mode has, with reason, been preferred by the convention. They have submitted the regulation of elections for federal government, in the first instance, to the local administrations, which, in ordinary cases, and when no improper views prevail, may be both more convenient and more satisfactory. But they have reserved to the national authority a right to interpose whenever extraordinary circumstances might render that interposition necessary to its safety. Nothing can be more evident than that an exclusive power of regulating elections for the national government in the hand of the state legislatures would leave the existence of the Union entirely at their mercy. They could, at any moment, annihilate it by neglecting to provide for the choice of persons to administer its affairs. It is to little purpose to say that a neglect or omission of this kind would not be likely to take place. The constitutional possibility of the thing, without an equivalent for the risk, is an unanswerable objection. Nor has any satisfactory reason been yet assigned for incurring that risk. The extravagant surmises of a distempered jealousy can never be dignified with that character. If we are in a humor to presume abuses of power, It is as fair to presume them on the part of the state governments as is on the part of the general government, and as it is more consonant to the rules of the just theory to trust the Union with the care of its own existence than to transfer that care to any other hands, if abuses of power are to be hazarded on the one side or on the other, it is more rational to hazard them where the power would naturally have been placed than where it would unnaturally be placed. Suppose an article had been introduced into the Constitution empowering the United States to regulate the elections for the particular states. Would any man have hesitated to condemn it, both as an unwarrantable transposition of power and as a premeditated engine for the destruction of state governments? The violation of principle, in this case, would have required no comment. And to an unbiased observer, it will not be less apparent in the project of subjecting the existence of the national government in a similar respect to the pleasure of the state governments. An impartial view of the matter cannot fail to result in a conviction that each, as far as possible, ought to depend on itself for its own preservation. As an object to this position, it may be remarked that the constitution of the National Senate would involve, in its full extent, the danger which it is suggested might flow from an exclusive power in the state legislatures to regulate the federal elections. It may be alleged that by declining the appointment of senators, they might at any time give a fatal blow to the Union, and from this it might be inferred that as its existence would thus be rendered dependent upon them in so essential a point, there can be no objection to entrusting them with it in the particular case under consideration. The interest of each state, it may be added, to maintain its representation in the national councils, would be a complete security against an abuse of the trust. This argument, though specious, would not, upon examination, be found solid. It is certainly true that the state legislatures, by forbearing the appointments of senators, may destroy the national government. But it will not follow that, because they have a power to do this in one instance, they ought to have it in every other. There are cases in which the pernicious tendency of such a power may be far more decisive without any motive equally cogent with that which must have been regulated to the conduct of the convention in respect to the formation of the Senate to recommend their admission into the system. So far as that construction may expose the Union to the possibility of injury from the state legislatures, it is an evil. But it is an evil which could not have been avoided without excluding the states, in their political capacities, wholly from a place in the organization of the national government. If this had been done, it would doubtless have been interpreted into an entire dereliction of the federal principle, and would certainly have deprived the state governments of that absolute safeguard which they will enjoy under this provision. But, however wise it may have been to have submitted in this instance to an inconvenience for the attainment of a necessary advantage or a greater good, no inference can be drawn from this to favor an accumulation of the evil, where no necessity urges, nor any greater good invites. It may be easily discerned also that the national government would run a much greater risk from a power in the state legislatures over the election of its House of Representatives than from their power of appointing the members of its Senate. The senators are to be chosen for the period of 6 years. There is to be a rotation, by which the seats of a third part of them are to be vacated and replenished every 2 years. And no state is to be entitled to more than 2 senators. A quorum of the body is to consist of 16 members. The joint result of these circumstances would be that a temporary combination of a few states to intermit the appointment of senators could neither annul the existence nor impair the activity of the body. And it is not from a general and permanent combination of the states that we have anything to fear. The first might proceed from its sinister designs in the leading members of a few of the state legislatures, and the last would suppose a fixed and rooted disaffection in the great body of the people, which will either never exist at all, or will, in all probability, proceed from an experience of the inaptitude of the general government to the advancement of their happiness, in which event no good citizen could desire its continuance. We'll let that sit for just a second. But with regard to the Federal House of Representatives, there is intended to be a general election of members once in 2 years. If the state legislatures were to be invested with an exclusive power of regulating these elections, every period of making them would be a delicate crisis in the national situation, which might issue in a dissolution of the Union. If the leaders of a few of the most important states should have entered into a previous conspiracy to prevent an election, I shall not deny that there is a degree of weight in the observation that the interest of each state to be represented in the federal councils will be a security against the abuse of a power over its elections in the hand of the state legislatures. But the security will not be considered as complete by those who attend to the force of an obvious distinction between the interest of the people and the public felicity, and the interest of their local rulers and the power and consequence of their offices. The people of America may be warmly attached to the government of the Union at times when the particular rulers of particular states, stimulated by the natural rivalship of power and by the hopes of personal aggrandizement, and supported by a strong faction in each of those states, may be in very opposite temper. This diversity of sentiment between a majority of the people and the individuals who have the greatest credit in their councils is exemplified in some of the states at the present moment on the present question. The scheme of separate confederacies, which will always multiply the chances of ambition, will be a never failing bait to all such influential characters in the state administrations as are capable of preferring their own emolument and advancement to the public weal. With so effectual a weapon in their hands as the exclusive power of regulating elections for the national government, a combination of a few such men in a few of the most considerable states, where the temptation will always be the strongest, might accomplish the destruction of the Union by seizing the opportunity of some casual dissatisfaction among the people, and which perhaps they may themselves have excited, to discontinue the choice of members for the Federal House of Representatives. It ought never to be forgotten that a firm union of this country under an efficient government will probably be an increasing object of jealousy to more than one nation of Europe, and that enterprises to subvert it will sometimes originate in the intrigues of foreign powers, and will seldom fail to be patronized and abetted by some of them. Its preservation, therefore, ought in no case that can be avoided to be committed to the guardianship of any but those whose situations will uniformly beget an immediate interest in the faithful and vigilant performance of the trust. And so ends Federalist Paper number 59. And again, we are getting hammered with the fact that we should be an informed electorate, that we should not allow foreign governments to entangle themselves with our representatives for the point of fomenting revolution or dissolution. We're in the middle of that. I don't know if you're aware, but there's this guy, Yuri Bezmenov. He gave an interview back in the 80s, and he told us these step-by-step things that the communists do in order to subvert a nation. And we can see those things playing out today on college campuses. We can see today the will of the people being subverted by the screams of the minority for the influence of foreign powers. That is literally occurring right now. There are people out there screaming that we need a peaceful dissolution, that we need to separate into separate pieces. It's remarkably foolish. I've expounded prior many reasons why. The reason we're going through this is to expound the many reasons why we are indeed stronger as a union. The free trade between the states, the free travel between the states, the ability to get up and move and do what you want. All of these things are brand new. They're something that we here, through these papers and through the documents that they are designed to help us implement, and did, define the same problems that we are facing now that we faced in the 70s, that we faced in the 20s, that we faced in the 1800s. All of the same problems with different flavors attached, right? It was red Kool-Aid, now it's purple Kool-Aid, but it's still fucking Kool-Aid. Federalist Paper number 60. The same subject continued concerning the power of Congress to regulate the election of members from the New York Packet, Friday or Tuesday, February the 26th, 1788, authored by Alexander Hamilton, to the people of the state of New York. We have seen that an uncontrollable power over the elections to the federal government could not, without hazard, be committed to the state legislatures. Let us now see what would be the danger on the other side. That is, from confining the ultimate right of regulating its own elections into the Union itself. It is not pretended that this right would ever be used for the exclusion of any state from its share in the representation. The interest of all would, in this respect at least, be the security of all. But it is alleged that it might be employed in such a manner as to promote the elections of some favored class of men in exclusion of others, by confining the places of election to particular districts, and rendering it impracticable to the citizens at large to partake in the choice. Of all the chimerical suppositions, this seems to be the most chimerical. On the one hand, no rational calculation of probabilities would lead us to imagine that the disposition which a conduct so violent and extraordinary would imply could ever find its way into the national councils. And on the other, it may be concluded with certainty that if so improper a spirit should ever gain admittance into them, it would display itself in a form altogether different and far more decisive. The improbability of the attempt may be satisfactorily inferred from this single reflection, that it could never be made without causing an immediate revolt of the great body of the people, headed and directed by the state governments. It is not difficult to conceive that this characteristic right of freedom may, in certain turbulent and infectious seasons, be violated, in respect to a particular class of citizens, by a victorious and overbearing majority. But that so fundamental a privilege in a country so situated and enlightened should be invaded to the prejudice of the great mass of people by the deliberate policy of the government without occasioning a popular revolution is altogether inconceivable and incredible. In addition to this general reflection, there are considerations of a more precise nature, which forbid all apprehension on the subject. The dissimilarity in the ingredients which will compose the national government, and instill more in the manner in which they will be brought into action in its various branches, must form a powerful obstacle to a concert of views in any partial scheme of elections. There is sufficient diversity in the state of property, in the genius, manners, and habits of the people of the different parts of the Union, to occasion a material diversity of disposition in their representatives towards the different ranks and conditions in society. And though an intimate intercourse under the same government will promote a gradual assimilation in some of these respects, yet there are causes, as well physical as moral, which may, in a greater or lesser degree, permanently nourish different propensities and inclinations in this respect. But the circumstance which will be likely to have the greatest influence in the matter will be the dissimilar modes of constituting the several component parts of the government, the House of Representatives being to be elected immediately by the people, the Senate by the state legislatures, the President by electors chosen for that purpose by the people. There would be little probability of a common interest to cement these branches in a predilection for any particular class of electors. As to the Senate, it is impossible that any regulation of time and manner, which is all that is proposed to be submitted to the national government in respect to that body, can affect the spirit which will direct its choice of members. The collective sense of the state legislatures can never be influenced by extraneous circumstances of that sort. a consideration which alone ought to satisfy us that the discrimination apprehended would never be attempted. For what inducement could the Senate have to concur in a preference in which itself would not be included? Or to what purpose would it be established in reference to one branch of the legislature if it could not be extended to the other? The composition of the one would in this case counteract that of the other, and we can never suppose that it would embrace the appointments to the Senate, unless we can at the same time suppose the voluntary cooperation of the state legislatures. If we make the latter supposition, it then becomes immaterial where the power in question is placed, whether in their hands, or in those of the Union. But what is to be the object of this capricious partiality in the national councils? Is it to be exercised in a discrimination between the different departments of industry, or between the different kinds of property, or between the different degrees of property? Will it lean in favor of the landed interest, or the moneyed interest, or the mercantile interest, or the manufacturing interest? Or, to speak in the fashionable language of the adversaries of the Constitution, will it court the elevation of the wealthy and the well-born, to the exclusion and debasement of all the rest of society? If this partiality is to be exerted in favor of those who are concerned in any particular description of industry or property, I presume it will readily be admitted that the competition for it will lie between landed men and merchants. And I scruple not to affirm that it is infinitely less likely that either of them should gain an ascendant in the national councils than that the one or the other of them should predominate in all the local councils. The inference will be that a conduct tending to give an undue preference to either is much less to be dreaded from the former than from the latter. The several states are in various degrees addicted to agriculture and commerce. In most, if not all of them, agriculture is predominant. In a few of them, however, commerce nearly divides its empire, and in most of them has a considerable share of influence. In proportion as either prevails, it will be conveyed into the national interest representation, and for the very reason that this will be an emanation from a greater variety of interest and in much more various proportions than are to be found in any single state, it will be much less apt to espouse either of them with decided partiality than the representation of any single state. In a country consisting chiefly of the cultivators of land, where the rules of an equal representation obtain, the landed interest must, upon the whole, preponderate in the government. As long as this interest prevails in most of the state legislatures, so long as it must maintain a correspondent superiority in the national Senate, which will generally be a faithful copy of the majorities of those assemblies. It cannot, therefore, be presumed that a sacrifice of the landed to the mercantile class will ever be a favorite object of this branch of the federal legislature. In applying thus particularly to the state Senate a general observation suggested by the situation of the country, I am governed by the consideration that the credulous votaries of the state power cannot, upon their own principles, suspect that the state legislatures would be warped from their duty by any external influence. But, in reality, the same situation must have the same effect. In the primitive composition of at least the federal House of Representatives, an improper bias toward the mercantile class is as little to be expected from this quarter as from the other. In order, perhaps, to give countenance to the objection at any rate, it may be asked, is there not a danger of an opposite bias in the national government which may dispose it to endeavor to secure a monopoly of the federal administration to the landed class? As there is little likelihood that the supposition of such a bias will have any terrors for those who would be immediately injured by it, a labored answer to this question will be dispensed with. It will be sufficient to remark, first, that for the reasons elsewhere assigned, it is less likely that any decided partiality should prevail in the councils of the Union than in any of its members. Secondly, that there would be no temptation to violate the Constitution in favor of the landed class, because That class would, in the natural course of things, enjoy as great a preponderancy as itself could desire, and thirdly, that men accustomed to investigate the sources of public propensity on a large scale must be too well convinced of the utility of commerce to be inclined to inflict upon it so deep a wound as would result from the entire exclusion of those who would best understand its interests from a share in the management of them. The importance of commerce in the view of revenue alone must effectually guard against the enmity of a body which would be continually importuned in its favor by the urgent calls of public necessity. I the rather consult brevity in the discussing of a probability of a preference founded upon a discrimination between the different kinds of industry and property, because, as far as I understand the meaning of the objectors, they contemplate a discrimination of another kind. They appear to have in view, as the objects of the preference with which they endeavor to alarm us, those whom they designate by the description of the wealthy and the well-born. These, it seems, are to be exalted into an odious preeminence over the rest of their fellow citizens. At one time, however, their elevation is to be a necessary consequence of the smallness of the representative body. At another time, it is to be effected by depriving the people at large of the opportunity of exercising their right of suffrage in the choice of that body. But upon what principle is the discrimination of the places of election to be made, in order to answer the purpose of the meditated preference? Are the wealthy and the well-born, as they are called, confined to particular spots in the several states? Have they, by some miraculous instinct or foresight, set apart in each of them a common place of residence? Are they only to be met with in the towns or cities, or are they, on the contrary, scattered over the face of the country as avarice and chance have happened to cast their own lot or that of their predecessors? If the latter is the case, as every intelligent man knows it to be, one, is it not evident that the policy of confining the places of election to particular districts would be as subversive to its own aim as it would be exceptionable on every other account? The truth is that there is no method of securing to the rich the preference apprehended, but by prescribing qualifications of property, either for those who may elect or be elected. But this forms no part of the power to be conferred upon the national government. Its authority would be expressly restricted to the regulation of the times, the places, and the manner of elections. The qualifications of the persons who may choose or be chosen, as has been remarked on other occasions, are defined and fixed in the Constitution, and are unalterable by the legislature. Let it, however, be admitted for argument's sake that the expedient suggested might be successful, and let it at the same time be equally taken for granted that all the scruples which a sense of duty or an apprehension of the danger of the experiment might inspire were overcome in the breast of the national rulers. Still, I imagine it will hardly be pretended that they could ever hope to carry such an enterprise into execution without the aid of a military force sufficient to subdue the resistance of the great body of the people. The improbability of the existence of a force equal to that object has been discussed and demonstrated in different parts of these papers, but that the futility of the objection under consideration may appear in the strongest light, it shall be conceded for a moment that such a force might exist, and the national government shall be supposed to be in the actual possession of it. What will be the conclusion? With the disposition to invade the essential rights of the community, and with the means of gratifying that disposition, is it presumable that the persons who are actuated by it would amuse themselves in the ridiculous task of fabricating election laws for securing a preference to a favorite class of men? Would they not be likely to confer a conduct better adapted to their own immediate aggrandizement? Would they not rather boldly resolve to perpetuate themselves in office by one decisive act of usurpation, than to trust to precarious expedients which, in spite of all the precautions that might accompany them, might terminate in the dismissal, disgrace, and ruin of their authors? Would they not fear that citizens, not less tenacious than conscious of their rights, would flock from the remote extremes of their respective states to the places of election, and to overthrow their tyrants, and to substitute men who would be disposed to avenge the violated majesty of the people? And so ends Federalist Paper number 60. And here we get a good example of the last recourse of the people. Right? It is restricted from the federal government to choose who you get to vote for. It is left up to the states as to the people who will be voted for and the manner of their election, but it is not for them to deny anybody the ability to be voted for without the exception of they violated the law. We have that problem in several of the states today, and it has been ruled upon and it has been found unconstitutional for good reason. But had it not, we are given a recourse. We, the people, are the recourse. The assumption that there would never be an overbearing military was probably not the best one. We are outgunned, outmanned, and outclassed in large part. Most of our current militia is made up of hunters and people who previously served in those things, but we don't have the weapons of war that we were intended to have. You should be able to have a tank in your front yard. You should be able to have a private fighter jet. If you are capable of securing and using these things, they should be available to you. They are available to private corporations. They do it all the time. Raytheon, BlackRock, these places have private aircraft. They have private warships. You should be able to as well. No corporation should have any right that the average citizen does not have. You should be able to fully defend yourself and to protect yourself from the usurpations of an overbearing government, whether that is a state government, which we have a national response to, or if it's a national government, we have a state response to. You should be the last recourse. You should be the final stand that is made. It should be you. It should be me. It should be every single person who values freedom. We should all endeavor earnestly to be as informed as we possibly can. It is one of the reasons why we are energetically investing. Right? Reading this aloud is investing, in my opinion, my energy into this union. I think we have the best system, even if it's not perfect. Nothing is ever perfect. It is the striving for perfect that is the experience that is life. And so we should be striving for better, but we have what is better than everyone else on the planet. We should be prepared to fight to the last breath to protect that. Hopefully I brought a little bit of enlightenment and not too much confusion to a somewhat difficult topic. There wasn't anything overly complicated in this today. There are several examples that are definitely bearing into us today, and some of them I skipped over for want of not being too controversial, because censorship is a thing in the United States if you did not know. To the crew, thanks for hanging out. I appreciate every single minute that you are here with me, and I am praying for you every single day. Until next time, I love you. God loves you. You are perfect, whole, and complete, just the way that you are. And this has been Pitt's Take. Peace.